All right. Well, the theme of my keynote speech is about the structuralist development, macroeconomics, and new developmentalism, recent developments and perspectives. I prepare the presentation, the structure of the presentation in 6 points. First of all, we will do an overview of new developmentalism and structuralist development macroeconomics. In the sequence, we will talk about the structuralist development macroeconomics as a synthesis between classical development theory, Latin American structuralism, and post-Keynesian growth theory. After that, we will show the core propositions of the structuralist development macroeconomics. These core propositions evolved over time, so I think that is much more based on my recent work with my wife, Kalinka Martins da Silva, and Marvel Davila Fernandes. So after presenting the core propositions of structuralist development macroeconomics, I will present which is for now the standard model of new developmentalism, which is the Oreiro, Martins, and Davila Fernandes 2019 and 2020 model. After presenting this model, we will present how a developing country can get stuck in a middle income trap. And finally, I will present the problem that I think is the major issue for structuralism, development, macroeconomics, and new developmentalism to solve, which is the political economy problem of getting out of a middle income trap. So, there is a Brazilian new developmentalist school. The Brazilian new developmentalist school, as also known as Consensus of São Paulo, this name was not given by me or by Bresser Pereira, but by Professor Roberto Boyer in his comments on the 2009 book published by Bresser Pereira. So this school can be understood as an approach to the deep determinants of economic development, in which macroeconomic policy regime has a key role in explaining the long-term growth differentials among countries, notably middle-income countries. It's important to quote Madsen's article published in 1988. On this article, Madsen makes a clear distinction between the immediate and deep determinants of economic development. What are the immediate determinants? Well, basically the existing amount of physical and human capital, the availability of natural resources, the efficiency in the use of existing productive resources, and the level of technical and scientific knowledge existing at a given point of time. But there is another set of determinants, which Madsen calls deep determinants of economic development. Deep determinants refer to the reasons why countries differ from each other in terms of availability of factors that determine the level of per capita income. Among the deep determinants, we can list geography, institutions, income distribution, and economic policy regimes. For new developmentalism, economic policy regime is the deep cause of economic development. So I think that is our major difference for explanations like the one given by Acemoglu, for instance, which thinks that institutions are the deep determinant of economic development. For our interpretation, the economic policy regime is the really deep cause of why income differs between countries. Well, this school has a founding father, which is Professor Luis Carlos Bresser Pereira. He was former Minister of Finance of Brazil in 1987, and then during the Fernando Henrique Cardoso government, he was Minister of Public Reform from 1995 to 1998, and in 1999 he was Minister of Science and Technology. So Professor Brescia Pereira has a great expertise not only in economic theory, but also in economic policy. So the school originated from the seminal works of Brescia Pereira, actually one paper published in 2006 and 2 books, one published in 2007, 2009. This last book called Competition and Globalization was published in Portuguese, English, and French, right? So the school originated from the seminal works of Brescia Pereira that defined the new developmentalism as a set of proposals for institutional reforms and economic policies by which the middle developing countries seek to achieve the level of per capita income of developed countries. This catching up strategy is explicitly based on the adoption of an export-led growth regime in which the promotion of exports of manufactured products induces the acceleration of the pace of capital accumulation and the introduction of technological progress and structural change. For this to occur, the real exchange rate must be maintained at a competitive level in the medium to long term, which requires the design of a macroeconomic policy regime that neutralizes the chronic overvaluation of the real exchange rate observed in these countries as a result of the combined effects of the Dutch disease and capital inflows due to the adoption of an external saving growth strategy. Well, here we have the photos of the main leaders of the new developmentalism. On the top, we see Professor Brescia Pereira. On the left, you can see myself. On the center, Professor Nelson Marconi from Getúlio Vargas Foundation of São Paulo. And finally, on the right, we have Professor Paulo Gala, which is also a professor of Getúlio Vargas Foundation, São Paulo, but he's also CEO of an investment bank in Brazil. So Paulo Gala is the rich guy of the group. Well, we have published 2 major books in English. The book on the right was a collection of articles that we developed in 2012 and 2013 during seminars organized by Brescia Pereira in São Paulo. So the book is called Financial Stability and Growth, Perspectives on Financial Regulation and New Developmentalism. It was edited by Luis Carlos Brescia Pereira, Ian Kregel, and Leonardo Bulamarchi. And the book on the left is a textbook called Developmental Macroeconomics, New Developmentalism as a Growth Strategy, which is written by Brescia Pereira, myself, and Nelson Marconi. Up to now, this book, Developmental Macroeconomics, is the basic textbook on new developmentalism. All right. Well, but we now have to see the connection between new developmentalism and structuralist development macroeconomics. New developmentalism is a set of economic proposals for middle-income countries to overcome the middle-income trap and thus make the catching up with high-income countries. So, new developmentalism is a set of economic proposals or economic reforms. These proposals or economic reforms are based in a new economic theory. This new economic theory is named Structuralist Development Macroeconomics, which can be understood as a synthesis between classical economic development, Latin American structuralism, and post-Keynesian growth and distribution theory. Well, let's talk briefly about all these theories. Beginning with classical development theory, I think that the basic nature or basic feature of classical development theory is the distinction between dual and mature economies. I think that the Professor Peter Scott will talk about this tomorrow on his keynote address to this workshop. But the distinction between dual and mature economies was due to Arthur Lewis' paper published in 1954, remembering that Arthur Lewis wins the Nobel Prize of Economics. What is a dual economy? A dual economy is an economy with two sectors, a modern or capitalist sector and the traditional or subsistence sector. The subsistence sector employs no capital and hence had very low labor productivity. Wages in the subsistence sector are thus determined by the average productive labor. The modern sector employs capital and uses the modern techniques developed on the high-income countries. So, in the modern sector, labor productivity is high. The subsistence sector acts as an unlimited source of labor supply for the modern sector. Then, wages in the modern sector are determined by the subsistence wage given by the technical conditions of production in the subsistence sector, plus a premium for labor to accept the harder worker conditions, which means the harder discipline of the modern sector. There is an important observation that has to be made about classical development theory, is that in this theory, there is no Keynesian unemployment. Everyone who is fired from the modern sector can have a job in the subsistence sector. Thus, the relevant economic problem for classical development theory is not aggregate demand efficiency, but structural transformation. Labor have to be transferred from subsistence sector to the modern sector in order to increase the average labor productivity and income per capita. And another important feature is that there is no saving shortage, according to the classical development theory. While there is labor on the subsistence sector, the increase in average productivity made possible by the expansion of the modern sector will be appropriated by profits, because wages are constant and given at subsistence level. So profit share will rise, increasing the average saving of the economy. However, there can be what is called low income traps due to the existence of externalities and increasing returns in the modern sector. The rate of profit can be a positive function of the stock of capital instead of a negative function, as occurs in the neoclassical economic theory, due to increasing returns. So an economy can get in a low income track due to lack incentives for investment instead of lack of savings. Well, this figure I take from Haas' book, 2013 book on economic development. Basically, this is a synthesis between Lewis and Rosenstein-Rodin ideas. We have two curves. The first curve, the model is log linearized. So W is wage. So L in W is the wage prevailing at the economy. You can see in the figure that there is a flat portion of the curve, which means that wages are constant until all labor is transferred from the subsistence sector to the modern sector. This kink in the curve is what we called the Lewis point. Lewis point means a situation in which all labor are transferred from the subsistence sector to the modern sector. So after that, after the Lewis point, wages are no longer constant at the subsistence level, but increases with capital accumulation. The other curve, the positive slope with the one, is LN W star, represents the real wage that is compatible with a steady state growth, which means is compatible with a constant stock of capital per unit of time. Due to the existence of increasing returns, this curve is positive sloped. So when we join these two curves together, we define three steady states for the model. The first steady state is S, which means that all labor is employed in the subsistence sector. The second steady state is U, where part of the labor force is employed on the modern sector, but there is still a large share of labor force employed on the subsistence sector. And finally, we have the M steady state, where all the labor force is employed on the modern sector. Well, what the figure shows is that the intermediate steady state, the steady state where middle of the labor force is employed on the modern sector and the rest in the subsistence sector, is an unstable steady state, which means that if the economy is operating at the left of this steady state, the economy will return to the steady state S, where all labor force return to the subsistence sector. So this model shows the poverty trap. If capital accumulation was not enough, which means the stock of capital had accumulated at the left of the LNKU, then the economy will not be capable to have a sustained process of economic growth. So that's the question, the basic question raised by classical development theory. But the second school of thought that have influence over structuralist development macroeconomics is the Latin American structuralism. Well, the magnum opus of this school of thought is José Prebes' article, published originally in 1949 for the first conference of the ECLAC, the Economic Mission for Latin American and Caribbean. The title in Spanish is El Desarrollo Económico de América Latina y algunos de sus principales problemas. The translation in English will be the economic development of Latin America and some of its main problems. This article is reproduced in the Desarrollo Económico Journal in 1986 due to the death of José Prebes, which is the greatest Latin American economist of all times. Well, on this article, structural change, understood as industrialization, which means increasing the participation of manufacturing employment in total employment, is a necessary, although not sufficient, condition for a sustained increase in the standard of living of Latin American countries. The major obstacle for that is the international division of labor and the role of Latin American countries in it. There is the basic concept of Latin American structuralism is the center-periphery nexus. The center countries had an homogeneous and diversified structure of production. Labor productivity is similar through different sectors and activities, and these countries produce and export many types of different goods. Also, technological progress is originated in these countries and then spread to the peripheral countries. Technological progress in these countries result, this is important to observe, result in higher wages and hence in constant export prices. Well, peripheral countries have a productive structure which is heterogeneous and specialized at the same time. These countries have a small modern export sector specialized in produce and export primary goods for the central countries and a very large subsistence sector. There are large differences in labor productivity between sectors, and exports had a very low income elasticity. And I have to stress that the problem of income elasticities was first addressed by Hal Prebisch, not by Professor Anthony Tyrrell. Technological progress incorporated in the primary sector results in a reduction of prices of export goods. This means that deterioration in terms of that will occur, a deterioration in the terms of trade, which makes the fruits of technological progress in the peripheral countries to be appropriated by central countries. That is the basic reason of uneven growth between central countries and developed and peripheral countries. Well, regarding the deterioration of terms of trade, I reproduce a table that was published on House Prebisch article, which presents the relation between the prices of primary goods and manufacturing goods for Latin America in the period between 1876 to 1947. What we can see that during this period of time, there is a substantial deterioration of terms of trade for Latin American countries, which means that some part of the technological progress originated in Latin American economies was appropriated by central countries due to the deterioration in the terms of trade. Well, finally, the post-Keynesian growth theory. Well, there is a lot of models of post-Keynesian growth, but for us, the model that really matters is the one presented by Calder in 1988. I believe that is a post-mortem description. This article of Calder was published in a book organized by Alain Barrère in 1988. Well, in this article, Calder tells that the rate of creation of productive resources is determined by the rate of expansion of aggregate demand, more specifically by the expansion of those components of aggregate demand that are autonomous in the relation to the level and or change of output and income. In this framework, the investment rate adjusts itself in the long run to make the warranted rate of growth compatible with the growth rate of non-capacity generating autonomous demand. And there are two sources of non-capacity generating autonomous demand: government expanding and exports. Well, Tyrrell, in his 2002 book, affirmed that exports is the only true source of autonomous demand in the economic system, since it is the only component that is really exogenous. And in the article of Tyrrell and Ledesma, published in 2002 in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, the natural growth rate is endogenous, since productivity growth depends on the rate of capital accumulation, which is led by growth of autonomous demand, and on the rate of growth or manufacturing output, which depends on the growth rate of output. Okay. And finally, you have the Thero's law as another model of post-Keynesian demand-led growth model. The Thero's law given the true constraint for economic growth according to the post-Keynesian theory of growth. The constraint to long-run growth is not given by supply side, but by balance of payments. So the maximum rate of growth of real output in the long run is given by the Thero's law. The equation that we are seeing on the right, GBPGC is the growth rate of real output that is compatible with the balance of payments constrained. This is equal to the ratio of income elasticities of exports and income elasticities of import. This ratio multiplied by the growth rate of output in the rest of the world. Okay, so this is the schools of thought that contributed to the development of a structuralist development macroeconomics. Well, another few comments are necessary regarding structuralist development macroeconomics. Usually, textbooks treat separately macroeconomics, which is seen as the study of cyclical fluctuations, and economic development seen as the study of the long-term trend of capitalist economies. However, recent developments in the econometrics of time series had shown that it is incorrect that the composition of real output behavior in trend and cycle. This is because the time series for the gross domestic product, both for developed and developing countries, present unit root, so that temporary shocks, which can be shocks of demand or supply, have permanent effects over current output. This means that the cyclical component of economic activity, traditionally associated with the variations of aggregate demand in the short term, affects also the growth trend of capitalist economies in the long term. In this context, the growth trend becomes dependent on the trajectory that capitalist economy effectively describes over time. This phenomenon is known in the literature as path dependence. Well, if that is so, it's not therefore reasonable to separate macroeconomics from the theory of economic development. More reasonable is to unite the two areas under the name of macroeconomics of development. But our vision of economic development is a structuralist vision. What we will introduce here is a structuralist development macroeconomics that can be defined as follows. Is the economic theory that explains economic development as a historical process of capital accumulation and incorporation of technological progress and structure change, in which the accumulation depends on the existence of profitable investment opportunities offered by the sustained growth of demand, which on its turn depend on the even increase of both domestic markets and exports. Okay, now we can see the core principles of structuralist development macroeconomics. I will announce that, but it will be very clear on the presentation of the model how these principles are formally incorporated in a mathematical model. The first principle is the idea that the rate of economic growth is determined by the growth rate of exports. So it's a demand-led growth model, and we accept Thero's assertion that exports is the only source of autonomous demand in an economy. The growth rate of labor productivity depends on both the growth rate of real output and manufacturing share. So the natural growth rate is endogenous. It's important to stress. The ratio of exports and imports elasticity is, however, not constant over time. This is an important difference regarding Professor Thiro's work, but depends on the manufacturing share. So the balance of payments constrained growth rate is also an endogenous variable. The dynamics of manufacturing share depends both on price competitiveness, which depends mainly on the level of real exchange rate, as well as in non-price competitiveness, which depends mainly on technological gap of manufacturing firms. The level of real exchange rate for which the manufacturing share is constant over time is called the industrial equilibrium exchange rate. The level of real exchange rate for which the current account of balance of payments is at balance is the current account equilibrium exchange rate. So structuralist development macroeconomics has two concepts of equilibrium exchange rate. The first one is the industrial equilibrium exchange rate. The other is the current account equilibrium exchange rate. The question is why these concepts are different. Well, this is because the existence of cheap natural resources can make industrial equilibrium exchange rate higher, which means more devaluated, than current account equilibrium exchange rate due to the recurring rents generated by the exploration of natural resources. The real exchange rate compatible with a reasonable rate of profit in the manufacturing share is so much higher, which means depreciated, than the one in the primary sector. This is what we called Dutch disease. Dutch disease, so, is the existence, is the problem caused by the existence of recurrent rents associated with exploration of natural resources, which makes the real exchange rate compatible with a reasonable rate of profits for the manufacturing share, more lower than the rate of profit compatible with the reasonable profit for the primary sector of the economy. Well, actual real exchange rate can be lower than current account equilibrium exchange rate due to the adoption of a growth with foreign of savings model. The foreign of savings model is based in the Washington Consensus and establishes that middle-income countries need foreign saving to increase their investment rate and hence growth at a higher pace. This model, it's important to know, assumes that foreign and domestic savings are complementary one to another. Structuralist development macroeconomics, on the other way, says that foreign and domestic savings are substitutes. In order to attract foreign saving, it is necessary to appreciate the real exchange rate, which will result in an artificial, as important to stress, an artificial increase in the wage share and hence a reduction in the domestic saving, since propensity to save out of profits is higher than the propensity to save out of wages. Here is clearly the influence of Caldor-Pasinetti theory of distribution. Moreover, to attract foreign savings is necessary to set domestic interest rate at a level higher than the one given by the uncovered interest parity, which is given by international interest rate plus country risk premium. So, middle income trap occurs in countries that suffer from Dutch disease and all adopt the foreign savings model. In order to get rid of the middle income trap, a country may have a competitive exchange rate, which requires two things. First, to set the domestic interest rate at a level compatible with the uncovered interest parity, and two, neutralize Dutch disease by taxes over exports of primary goods and the adoption of a managed floating exchange regime. If country is if a country is successful in neutralizing the Dutch disease, then it will run with a small current account surplus. Well, now we present the basic new developmentalist model, de Oreiro, Martins, and Davila Fernandes. We see the photos of the co-authors. There are two versions of this model. The first one, published by me and my wife, Kalinka Martins, as a working paper in the Post-Keynesian Economic Society website. And then we invited Marvel to improve the model in mathematical way. It's more sophisticated and use computer simulations as a beautiful model. And we published it last year on the structural change and economic dynamics. So here we have the structure of the equations. Equation 4 is equation for the dynamics of employment ratio. The rate of change of employment rate is given by the difference of the growth rate of real output, the growth rate of labor productivity, and the growth rate of labor force. The growth rate of labor productivity depends on the gamma variable. Gamma is the manufacturing share. So equation 2 shows clearly that an increase in the manufacturing share in output is associated with an increase in the growth rate of labor productivity. So equation 2 says that the structure of employment and production matters. When a country suffers from deindustrialization, mainly if it is a premature deindustrialization, it will have a reduction in the growth rate of labor productivity. Equation 13 is just the growth rate of real output determined by aggregate demand. G is the growth rate of government expenditures. Gx is the rate of growth of exports. Alpha is the weight of government expenditures in autonomous demand, and H dot is the rate of change of rate of investment, and sigma is the Hicks-Harrod supermultiplier. I do not use the term Sraffian supermultiplier because it's absolutely wrong, since Piero Sraffa never wrote a line about the determination of output and employment in the long run. Okay, equation 16 shows the dynamics of the capacity utilization. Equation 17 shows the dynamic of the investment rate. The investment rate depends on the difference between actual capacity utilization and normal rate of capacity utilization. If firms are running with a rate of capacity utilization higher than the normal level, they will increase the investment rate. Otherwise, they will decrease the investment rate. Equation 18 shows the evolution of the composition of autonomous demand through time. So if the growth rate of government expenditures is higher than the growth rate of exports, the weight, the share of government expenditures in autonomous demand will increase over time. Otherwise, it will decrease. Equation 25 shows that after some algebraic manipulations, that the growth rate of manufacturing share depends on the difference between the actual level of real exchange rate and industrial equilibrium exchange rate. That is defined endogenously on the model. It's not an ad hoc variable. So when we have overvaluation of real exchange rate, which means actual real exchange rate lower than industrial equilibrium exchange rate, then the growth rate, the manufacturing share will reduce over time. Equation 16 shows the current account deficit as a ratio to GDP. The bar in the variable D on the left-hand side of the equation means the target of foreign savings defined by the economic policy authorities. The idea of adoption of a growth model with foreign savings is that the policymakers define a target for the current account deficit as a ratio for GDP, because the current account deficit as a ratio to GDP is precisely the external savings. So if balance of payments is in equilibrium, so there is no variation in international reserves, the deficit in the current account had to be financed by a surplus on the capital account. In order to generate enough surplus in the current account, the level of domestic interest rate I has to be higher than the one given by the uncovered interest parity, which is the sum of international interest rate IF and the country risk premium whole. Equation 36 shows the profit share of the economy. On this economy, the profit share depends on the real exchange rate. If you increase the real exchange rate, which means depreciate the real exchange rate, you will increase the profit share, so you will reduce the wage share. And finally, equation 41 is the inflation equation of the model. You can see that inflation had three components. There is a component of distributive conflict, which is the difference between the actual share of profits, and P star, which is the desired level of profits, desired wage share by the labor unions. So when inflation is high, when the profit share is higher than the desired profit share by labor unions, they will demand higher nominal wage increases, which will be passed by prices and so increase inflation. The second term is a component of inflation inertia. We are not assuming full inflation inertia, so M2 is lower than 1, and G epsilon is the growth rate of labor productivity. Well, the model has a steady state solution. So in the steady state, the growth rate of exports determines the natural growth rate, basically because the adjustment variable is the manufacturing share. In the steady state, the actual level of capacity utilization is equal to the normal. Equation 21 given the steady state level of the rate of investment. Please notice that the steady state level of the rate of investment depends on the growth rate of exports. So when the country increases the growth rate of exports, it will also increase the investment rate in the long run. Equation 19 says that in the long run, the growth rate of government spending have to be equal to the growth rate of exports, which means that the growth rate of government spending have to be an endogenous variable. So there is no such a kind of autonomous fiscal policy in the long run. Equation 24 presents the determinants of the industrial equilibrium exchange rate. Equation 29 presents the determination of the real exchange rate that is compatible with the target for foreign savings. Equation 31 presents the actual or equilibrium level of domestic interest rate. You can see in equation 31 that domestic interest rate will be higher than the level given by uncovered interest parity. Well, equation 36 is again the profit share, and equation 42 is the steady state rate of inflation. Well, the exogenous variables are the model are N, Gx, Un, V, delta G, D bar, EF, Ho, and P star. And the endogenous variables are gamma, U, H, GG, K, E, pi, and P hat. So there are 8 endogenous variables for a system with 9 independent equations, which means that the model is overdetermined. Well, so we have the overdetermination problem. The overdetermination problem occurs because real exchange rate had to accomplish 2 different roles in the model. The first role is to generate a sufficiently high level of price competitiveness in order to compensate domestic firms for their lack of non-price competitiveness due to technological gap. The level of real exchange rate that do this role is the industrial equilibrium exchange rate. The second role is to attract foreign capital inflows in order to generate the desired level of external savings by policymakers. This requires policymakers to set domestic interest rate at a higher level than the one given by the uncovered interest rate parity, but it is impossible for the real exchange rate to accomplish both roles, since due to the existence of Dutch disease, a real exchange rate at the industrial equilibrium level would generate a negative external savings, which means a current account surplus, just opposite what is desired by policymakers. The only possible solution for the overdetermination problem is to make D an endogenous variable, which means that policymakers may let the current account deficit to assume the value that is compatible with the real exchange rate at its industrial equilibrium level. Well, now I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I believe that I still have 5 minutes. How a development economy can get stuck in a middle-income trap according to the new developmentalist school. The experience of many Latin American countries in the period between 1970 and 1990 clearly show that the change in economic policy regime was the adoption of some version of the external savings growth model. In the case of Brazil, this model was adopted after 1973 in the context of the second National Development Plan in the government of General Ernesto Geisel. This second PND was designed to be a massive program of government investment expenditures in oil exploration and production of capital goods, which are required to complete the process of import substitution that had started in the beginning of the 30s. The program generated a huge current account deficit and the fast accumulation of external debt that increased from lower $8 billion in 1971 to more than $70 billion in 1981, a 10-time increase in a decade. The evolution of external debt was clearly unsustainable and resulted in an external debt crisis in the early 80s, which was the immediate cause of growth slowdown of the Brazilian economy during the whole decade. The full adoption of the external saving growth model was only possible, however, in the 90s after the financial liberalization occurred during Fernando Collor government, which starts a process of increasing openness of capital account. Finally, under Fernando Henrique Cardoso government, the external saving model was converted in an official government policy because the successful implementation of Plano Real for inflation stabilization was due to the introduction of an exchange rate anchor, which required domestic interest rates at very high level in order to attract capital inflows and make real exchange rates to appreciate. Once the external growth model is adopted, the real exchange rate starts to overvalue and will remain in a level that is incompatible with the industrial equilibrium. The overvaluation of real exchange rate will start a premature deindustrialization process and hence a slowdown in the growth rate of labor productivity. There will also be effects over the demand side of the economy. The appreciation of real exchange rate combined with the reduction of manufacturing share on real output will both increase the marginal propensity to import and other certain conditions will decrease the size of the supermultiplier. for a given level of autonomous expenditures, there will be a permanent fall in the level of real output and hence on capacity utilization. This fall of capacity utilization will result in a situation where actual rate of capacity utilization is lower than the normal one, thereby inducing a fall in the investment share. The fall in investment share will result in a reduction of the growth rate of real output relative to the growth rate of autonomous demand. If the fall of the growth rate of real output was higher than the fall in the growth rate of productivity of labor, then employment share will also start to decrease. The combined result of all these developments will be a stagnation of economic growth, reduction of capital accumulation, deindustrialization, growing levels of excess capacity, and increasing unemployment. The exchange rate depreciation will also have negative feedback effects over the growth rate of export, since the income elasticity of exports can be reduced as a result of the industrialization of the economy. And for that, the empirical evidence is on Oreiro, Micio, and Gonzaga paper. The reduction in the growth rate of autonomous demand will reinforce the decrease in the level of employment and in the level of capacity utilization. Here, finishing, is the political economy problem. The political economy problem to get out of the middle income trap is that it requires a huge exchange rate devaluation and hence a sharp decline in real wages in the short term. Once real exchange rate is set at a level slightly above the industrial equilibrium level, the manufacturing share could start increasing and productivity growth will accelerate. This will make for real wages to grow at a faster rate, making workers to recover their wage losses due to exchange rate devaluations in some years. I will show it in figure 2. And the political economy problem is so to convince workers and political actors that the long-term gains compensate the short-term losses. Well, the problems that Brazilians experience in the last 10 to 20 years appears to show that this can be an impossible task. That's here in this figure, the political economy problem of how to make the required devaluation of real exchange rate. In the short term, there will be a huge reduction on real wage, but the losses on real wage will be recovered after some transient period, and after that, they will be at higher level compared with the situation where the real exchange rate was overvalued. Well, that's what I have to speak for today. Thank you very much, and I'm open for how can stop screen? Okay. Thank you very much. Marvel?
Ok, aqui. Eu estava para pedir para o Luciano me colocar de novo. Muito obrigado. Thank you very much, Professor Oreiro, for such a clear presentation of the main principles and the main underlying model, right? The main underlying mechanisms and theoretical strands of the literature that influence the new developmentalist school. It was a very clear presentation. Over the past 45 minutes, I've been collecting some comments, some observations from our friends that are interacting with us in the other side of the screen, right? In their phones, in their computers, and also for the members of the group. We've been interacting, and a couple of questions came to the discussion, and I would like to share this couple of points with you. And I was wondering if in the next 10 minutes, perhaps you can comment on that. The first thing is thinking about the audience, and we have several from our friends that are following this workshop. We have several graduate students that are very much interested in the concept of of this industrial equilibrium exchange rate. So the first thing, perhaps, could you please elaborate more on this concept? What is the real equilibrium, the industrial equilibrium exchange rate? This is the first thing. And the second thing, again, because we have several graduate scholars following the workshop, what would you say are important open questions in neo-developmentalism? Because we have many things that are already clear, and you presented in the blocks of equations problems that we already solved. But what about problems that we have not solved yet, and perhaps there is work to be done in the next years, to come? So these two things, please. Could you please elaborate more in the industrial equilibrium exchange rate, and what about open questions for the next years?
All right, Mario, thanks for the comments. The industrial equilibrium exchange rate was firstly developed by Professor Brescia Pereira. When he developed the concept, he defined the industrial equilibrium exchange rate as the level of exchange rate that make domestic firms that operate with state-of-art technology competitive both international and domestic markets. So, well, I elaborated also this concept with him when we are writing the book published in 2015. But I always have a dislike about the concept, and I will tell why. For middle-income countries, it makes no sense to say that the major share of domestic firms operate with state-of-art technology. This is simply not true. Maybe in Brazil we have 2 or 3 firms that operate with state-of-art technology. I can say that Petrobras is the technological leader of exploration, oil exploration in underwater. Embraer is a technological leader in the production of middle range planes, and maybe the WEG in Santa Catarina is a technological leader in the production of capital goods. But 3 firms. The rest of the Brazilian manufacturing firms is not operating on the technological frontier, so they are behind the technological frontier. Well, when you are behind the technological frontier, in order to compete in the international markets, you must have another advantage. You must have a cost advantage relative to the firms that operate within the technological frontier. So the idea, the new concept of industrial equilibrium exchange rate that I defined last year in a paper published on Brazilian Journal of Political Economy is that the industrial equilibrium exchange rate will be defined as the level of real exchange rate that for a given level of technological gap make the manufacturing share constant over time. Why stress manufacturing share constant over time? Because it's precisely the definition of any equilibrium situation. An equilibrium situation is a situation that do not change endogenously, only if you have an exogenous shock. So what I'm saying is that the real exchange rate will be at the industrial equilibrium level if the manufacturing share is not expanding or contracting. So the firms are capable to maintain their their share in both international and domestic markets. So it is by definition a situation of equilibrium. Of course, that for a country to reindustrialize, you have to set the real exchange rate for some time period above the industrial equilibrium exchange rate in order for the manufacturing share to start expanding until some target I think that in the case of Brazil, we have now the manufacturing share is 10% of the added value. I think that we have to return to a value of more or less 20%. So this means that for many years, you have to set the actual level of exchange rate above of industrial equilibrium exchange rate. Well, regarding the open questions, I think there is theoretical and political economy questions. The theoretical questions, I believe, is to incorporate in the model the dynamics of technological gap, right? Technological gap in the model is still a constant. We say nothing about the evolution of technological gap. It will be interesting to show how the technological gap evolve over time with the real exchange rate. Another open question, but now I'm working with Giulio Guarini from Tuschia University in Italy, is to incorporate in the new developmentalism the ecological approach. I think that the discussion in the developed countries is increasingly how to protect the environment and how to reduce the emissions of CO2. And basically, new developmentalism up to now says nothing about this issue. So I created in this article with Giulio Guarini that will be published on the Brazilian Journal of Political Economy, the term green new developmentalism. I think that is a new line of research for the school of thought. Regarding the political economy problem, well, the political economy problem had to be solved by political scientists, is how to make, again, a class coalition that make it possible the implementation of a new developmentalist economic strategy. That's the political economy problem. It was not to be solved by me. I'm not a political scientist, but I think that political scientists can give good answers for this political economy problem.
Thank you very much again. We have some time. We need to have a break now before our next presentation, but we are still receiving questions. So perhaps in the next 2 to 3 minutes, if we could briefly assess, in your presentation, you explain to us, according to new developmentalists, the role of the interest rate for the overvaluation of the exchange rate. So you already talked a little bit about it, and you already mentioned that this relationship between a temporary decline in real wages in order to get out of the middle income trap. You also talk a little bit about that, but perhaps more with a flavor for the history of economic thought. You mentioned in your talk about the original structuralism. It goes back to Furtado and Prebisch. What about the neo-structuralism? Alla Fagenberg, for example, Professor Luis Fernando de Paula raised this question. Is it possible to link this new structuralism to new developmentalism?
I think that new structuralism do not see with good eyes the idea that real exchange rate is a device or a means for economic development. So I think that they make the distinction between genuine competitiveness and spurious competitiveness. And competitive exchange rate was saw by new structuralists as a spurious way for gaining competitiveness in international markets. Well, I do not agree with this definition, because overvalued exchange rate can be the result of Dutch disease, which makes creates a negative externality over the manufacturing share, over the manufacturing industry. So if there is a negative externality, you have to fix it. And can you fix it by taxes, or can you fix it by setting the correct level for real exchange rate? So I think that the only possible communication or exchange of ideas with new structuralism is how to introduce the non-price competitiveness in the model. So I return again to the question of technological gap. About the technological gap, the school has at this moment no answer. We simply take technological gap as a constant.
Thank you very much again. Thank you very much for your questions, our friends that are following us on YouTube. Thank you very much, Professor Oreiro, for this very clear presentation, for your time answering these questions. We will take now a break.